Well, hello, Carol Akers. Get yourself off mute where I can hear you there. My computer had trouble with that too the other day. I couldn't get it off mute. Well, it's good to see you. Mr. Bovee, how are you, sir?
Good. Okay, I'm doing well. Thank you.
Good to see you, Mr. McGrory.
Good evening, sir. We drove past your home last night. We don't envy you cutting the lawn.
Wasn't me cutting the lawn. In fact, I have it done today, and I would say the weather kind of prevented that. So
Yeah. We're not lucky for watering the lawn.
no. Yeah, I just was talking to my successor in Mobile. She started earlier in the month, and she was asking me a question about something. She said, "Yeah, we're starting to get about some 60-mile-an-hour wind gusts here," and I'm like, "God bless you." It's the third one of those that they've had. So, too many.
Is the rain we're having effects from Zeta?
It is a combination. It's partly the outer bands, and then it's also merging with some other storm that was forming over the Midwest. There we go. All up here on the grid. Make sure we are recording here. Should know how to do Zoom by now with all the classes. And I was on Zoom all day Monday, all day Tuesday for clergy conference. But I can't seem to get work up here. There we go. Got it. Jim Rousey is coming in. Carol, I'm trying to unmute you from my end, but it won't let me. Let's see. We can see you, and I can see you talking. You can hear me, can't you? Yeah. I'm going to ask you to unmute, but I don't think that's going to really do anything. Good evening, Mr. Rousey.
Now, how's that?
Oh, we got you.
I can hear you, Carol.
There you go.
Hi, Carol.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Hope you are.
I am.
Hello,
Have you
everyone.
heard-
I'm sorry.
Have you heard from Courtney?
She is traveling today. I've not heard from her. I've not heard from her since yesterday. So she will not be here as far as I understand. So
Right.
she has asked me to fill in.
Is she bringing her mother? Is she traveling with her mother?
That was the last word I heard, whether she's doing it or not. Her mother, as she said, is just a tad on the stutter side, which many of us can fit into that category. Good evening, Judy. Oh. Good evening, Judy.
Hello there.
Right. Let's see, besides Courtney, anyone else that's been on? Was Peggy Volk on last week?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody else? I've watched the videos. I thought I caught everybody, but of course, if you didn't speak, you don't get seen on the videos. So
That's all I can think of. There was another girl, another woman, but I didn't know her.
Was she on last week or the week before?
Maybe it was the week before.
Okay.
I missed last week. I had a conflict.
All right. Well, I've got 6:30. Yeah, and I don't know what Courtney has told you the time frame is, but those of you who've been with me know I like to say an hour, we're done. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll open us with a short prayer. Gracious and loving God, through your church, you have given us the tools to discern your will, to be able to gather in community that orients itself to working together to fulfill the kingdom that you are establishing here before our eyes. As we learn about the structure and governance of our church and how it relates to the society and the overall political structure of our country, that we may always be reminded that it is only through our engagement and our courage and our endurance that we have these structures that give us the opportunity to continue working for the betterment of all and for your glory in all things. Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Oh, here we go. Betsy and
Yeah, Betsy. That's
Victoria.
the other one. Betsy.
Victoria. Good. Well, I'll tell them you can vouch that I prayed. So
Right.
so good evening, Betsy. Good evening, Victoria. Always like seeing Victoria's chair there. It always makes me jealous. It looks so comfortable. So, all right. So we'll get started. So I think all of you know that Courtney is away. She is, I know, on the road today. I don't know if she has her mother in tow or not. I have not been told that. I texted her a little bit yesterday. I know she had said something about me probably doing part of this. Well, she asked me to do the whole thing for, which I'm more than happy to do, especially since it falls under things that I learned in seminary, at least things I should have learned in seminary, which I realized going back over some of my notes, how much of this I've forgotten outside of what I experience day to day. So today's topic is church governance and structure, which doesn't sound real exciting or a real sexy topic by any stretch of the imagination, but for understanding, number one, the Episcopal Church and how it works, but also number two is Courtney has been leading you all in this conversation around the political process and participation in that process and what our role as Christians are in that process. It's real helpful to see the similarities and the differences in how the Episcopal Church is set up. Now, some of this, I know some of you are lifelong Episcopalians. Some of you are fairly new to this. Some of this, you may just be like, yeah, I know all of this. And some of you may know none of this, and that's okay. You are welcome. I'll have some time at the end for discussion, but really you are welcome to ask questions as we go along. But so my emphasis tonight is I want to talk mainly about the, Judy Libby, the formation of the Episcopal Church from the colonial days up to right after the official formation of the Episcopal Church at the first General Convention. Well, hello, Libby's. I'm going to wave at you out my window here. So they are literally right over there from my direction. So welcome. Glad to have you all. So where I'd like to get started tonight as we go through the governance and structure of the church is when the overarching theme for me in this is how does the church and the political or the secular government, so to speak, how do they work together? Where do they overlap? What did they use or borrow from each other? And I'm just going to give you a little bit of history as we go through this. The two sources of history that I'm going to be using, besides things that I remember, hopefully that I remember, are this book, one of my seminary textbooks. It is A History of the Episcopal Church, How Original, by Robert Pritchard, who was one of my professors of church history in seminary at Virginia. And then the other document that I am using is, I need to look it up, it is out of the House of Bishops, which that will be one of our topics for today. It is called A Primer on the Government of the Episcopal Church and its Underlying Theology, offered by the Ecclesiology Committee of the House of Bishops, fall of 2013, revised several times after that. So basically a history of the governance of the church is told by the bishops of the church, who, that's one thing bishops do know a little bit about. They can quote you some canons and quote you some history. So way back at the beginning, most of us know that the first English settlers, permanent English settlers, that is, besides colonies such as Roanoke and others that did not last, was at Jamestown. And it's important to note that one of the most, that story of the governance of the Episcopal Church is formed through some of these initial charter companies that colonized what is now the US, one of those being the London Company, which became known as the Virginia Company, which is the mercantile group that sponsored Jamestown. And one of the practices that they started when they set up the colony at Jamestown and in other places, and I always mispronounce this word, those of you Anglophiles can correct me on this, but it is the word advowson, A-D-V-O-W-S-O-N. And what that was when you established a church, an individual would usually establish a church on a piece of property that they owned. This was a common practice in England as well. And what that was it's not only that you owned the land that the church was on, and of course you had a relationship with the church, but because of your privilege as a landowner, you had the right to present a candidate for the rector or the vicar of your parish, note that, to the bishop for consent to that office. Now in England, that was a fairly easy process to do. You write a letter or send a message to the bishop. It'd get there in a day or two. You'd have your response hopefully before too long. Obviously a little bit different scenario for colonists who it was not an easy process to get a message to the bishop in England. So one of the things that the Virginia Company then took to doing, as being good, loyal English colonists, was that they would send petitions for several candidates upon lands that they owned to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was recognized as the prime seat of the English diocese at the time, and of course is recognized today as the, in many ways, nominal head of what is called the Anglican Communion today. However, the Virginia Company, like several other of these mercantile companies, ultimately during the interregnum politics of England, depending on which king, particularly when Charles I came to power, who was a very pro-Catholic, pro-Episcopal king, revoked the charters, particularly in this case for the Virginia Company in 1624, and exercised more direct control upon these churches. However, that strategy in many ways backfired, because one of the institutions that rose up, particularly in Virginia and southern colonies, was this body called the vestry. Many of you have served on that body. Some of you, in fact, are on it now. And the vestry originally, back in medieval days, was simply a gathering of parishioners for the upkeep and maintenance of the church property. But Charles I either wasn't aware of this or didn't think this through too well. In 1598, Parliament passed a law which made vestries responsible for things such as taking care of the poor in the community. And also, as a result of that, vestries, and particularly in the colonies, began developing additional roles pretty much akin to a county government. They were taking care of roads. They were doing the management of taxes, even on certain occasions. But they became a fairly significant institution within the colonies. And as such, they became, in good old fashion of English churches, and what became known in the Church of England, ironically, as very strong lay authority within the church. But vestries in the colonies became opportunities for laity to gain further control and to begin taking power away from the crown and from the bishops in England and put it into their own hand. And so by the 1630s, churches in Virginia were electing their own rectors. Sometimes they might go to the governor, as they were supposed to, for consent of said rector. Sometimes they would just say, nah, I'm not going to bother with that. And they would just institute and install their rectors as well. One of the things that happened with this, which a question that I know was asked of me and has been asked to me about, how long do you stay as a rector and all of this stuff, and this whole priest in charge business that we're in right now. A rector in our church right now, and a rector traditionally in the Church of England, when either the bishop would appoint the rectors, was often the case in the Church of England, or whether it was chosen by the bishop or a vestry in the colonies, the rector usually had permanent tenure. You could only be removed by the bishop for misconduct, so to speak, of some sort. But the vestries in Virginia, after they began getting this power, pretty much wanted to not allow rectors permanent tenure, but wanted to give them instead a series of one-year contracts. So basically what's happening is that the laity, who are also taking care of a lot of the secular authority, are now becoming the top dog authorities within the parishes as well. And it was only, in fact, in 1804 that finally the Church of England and the Episcopal Church itself, after the establishment of the Episcopal Church, actually finally acquiesced officially to that policy and finally put a provision in, which still exists to this day, that allows parishes, when they're in dispute with their rectors, to appeal to the bishop. But back then, the vestries were in Virginia, and many of the southern colonies were fairly much in control. But a lot of things happened in 1688. I want to hear y'all speak, just make sure y'all are awake. For you Anglophiles, good English historians, what happened in 1688 in England? Anybody?
Restoration.
What's that?
Is that the Restoration?
No, on the Restoration. It was the Glorious Revolution. William and Mary coming to the throne. And William and Mary, when they came to the throne after the Restoration, which was, I think, 1660, if my dates are right, there was a push after the Restoration for a uniform movement within the Church of England. Ironically, it was when these quote-unquote foreigners came in, because a lot of English kings were not always English, as many of you know, but when William and Mary came in, they pushed and wanted to lobby colonial legislatures for official establishment of the Church of England in the colonies. Now, in the northern colonies, it was pretty much already established. Vestries were not really taking foothold in Anglican churches in the northern colonies, in large part because, of course, Congregationalists and then Presbyterians and some of the middle colonies were becoming the more dominant religious force. But so the Crown exercised control over northern colonies more directly, but William and Mary wanted to make full establishment of the church something that was uniform throughout the colonies. They wanted colonial governments to take responsibility of funding and supporting Anglican parishes. So basically a trickle down from the crown and the bishops in England through the governments that represented the crown in the colonies. And there was a treatise along these lines written in 1736 by the then Bishop of Gloucester, William Warburton, who wrote this treatise called The Alliance Between Church and State. Good relevant thing for our topic here, in which he writes in one segment, the church is the soul of the state. And if one were to teach natural religion to the people, they would then in turn become better citizens of the crown. So one of the most very overt statements made within this period of the relationship between state and church, that the church was to get people to be able to understand that God's law, this natural revealed law, this very rational law, very, very intellectual in its context, was something that would help one understand God, but also be someone who would be a loyal servant and citizen of the crown. And so as this relationship tightens up between the crown and the church and the colonies, the precursors to bishops, and we'll get to those here in just a minute, called commissaries, began showing up in the state, or in the colonies, I should say. And commissaries were essentially representatives of the bishops in England who performed functions like bishops for many outlying portions of dioceses. So there were commissaries in England who were in far-flung places within the countryside. But no matter how far-flung you are in England, you're not that far from your bishop. The colonies, of course, again, is a different story. And the Bishop of London in the 18th century, Henry Compton, is the one who decided to send commissaries and implement them across the American colonies. The first one was in Virginia, a guy named James Blair. James Blair was the one who established, in 93, William and Mary College. Wonder why? In Virginia, he set up, as the commissary, set up a convocation system of clergy, things such as morality laws, things that are very much tied to the church. But also he did things such as he helped to standardize the value of tobacco. Why is that important? Well, that's often in Virginia how clergy were paid. They were paid through tobacco. So I expect, instead of the next paycheck, I expect a good box of cigars the next time that my stipend comes in. But that was a very common thing in Virginia. But the commissaries, as you can see, have this authority. There's no dividing line here. There's ecclesiastical things, there's secular things, but they really blend across the board with one another. And by the 1740s, commissaries were present in 9 of the colonies. But their biggest problem was the fact that while they spoke for the crown and they spoke for the bishop, they did not, by canonical law, possess the authority of a bishop. And one of the areas in which this became very noteworthy was when the famous evangelist of that day, George Whitefield, among others, began preaching revivalist evangelicalism through the countryside. He was an Anglican priest preaching evangelical doctrine and sermons, and it became quite a scandal both in the colonies and even with England, because at that point, as talked about with that treatise, Alliance Between Church and State, Anglican theology, and in fact Anglican government, English government, was very centered around the discourse of people like John Locke and Isaac Newton, this very cerebral, intellectual, rational, reasoned approach to theology. Whitefield was far from that. He was about conversion experience. He was about charisma and getting people to have an encounter with the Holy Spirit. And the commissaries were absolutely powerless, not only to stop him, but to stop any clergy who were sympathetic to him in any way. So as a result, calls for bishops in the states began to come around as early as I could look up in 1706. In fact, Queen Anne, queen at the time, was actually pushing forth a piece of legislation in Parliament which would authorize the consecration of bishops within the colonies. But then she died. And so that sort of took care of that. The Whig majority in Parliament pretty much was a little more Congregationalist in tone. They did not want to encourage anything that would elevate the episcopacy for them, or bishops, in other words. And so that sort of dropped off and died off. Well, another commissary comes to the United States, or to the colonies, and that was Thomas Bray. Thomas Bray was the commissary in Maryland, if I recall. And Thomas Bray introduced two societies, one of which is very, very important. First one was one he introduced called the Society for the Promulgation of Christian Knowledge, SPCK. Sounds like a online charity that you would find today. Thomas Bray realized that one of the great things that was needed, particularly, and this was even before Whitefield became fairly popular, but we're starting to see this movement toward this more sort of emotive evangelicalism, was there was a great need for education, theological education and secular education in the colonies. So he provided that education both from the ecclesiastical, from Bible, theology, but also for general education for people within the parish lines. The other one he started was called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which is also, ironically, one of the official names of the Episcopal Church. You look in our canons, national canons, you will see that title within our language. And so the SPG, as it was called, was a missionary organization which supported colonial clergy and allowed, the SPCK and the SPG work together, partly to help educate clergy on this whole idea of natural reason within religion to bring others to the Christian faith. And one of the things that was a big emphasis for them, which might sound purely churchy, but was very important for the push that was coming back for bishops, both within the colonies and over in England, was the SPG, and Bray in particular emphasized baptism by a priest who is an apostolic succession. Guess who controls who are the priests and bishops in apostolic succession at that time? The state. And so here we see again this push going back towards more centralized control of the church back then. So Whitefield, as I mentioned, comes on the scene, and after he is sort of fizzling off the scene, there is a renewed call for the episcopate around 1746, again recognizing the weakness of the commissaries. And while there was a very strong push in the colonies, by this point, the revolution starts in 1775. So you can think 1746, by this point, there's starting to be some growing animosity with the colonists, and the English are picking up on this. And there's not really much of a favor within Parliament to send bishops, or to have let the Americans consecrate their own bishops, in other words, which would make them more independent and more stubborn to control by Parliament and the English bishops. But out of this push comes a proposal that was made at a provincial convention. I would use more of the word provincial gathering or network, a good contemporary word that we would use, in 1766. And this regional or provincial convention was organized by a priest named William Smith, who I think by this point he was the president of the College of Philadelphia. And so what was happening then is you had not just states or individual churches, but different states and regions were organizing into things called provinces. And from 1765 to 1767, you saw several states, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, that were beginning to organize these provincial conventions, once again calling for an episcopacy that was an American episcopacy. So, get past the Revolution, kind of an important time, but for our purposes, after the Revolution, and I'm sure most of y'all, all of y'all know this, that of course the Church of England, of all the institutions within the colonies, was one of the ones that suffered the most. Obviously, in the North, the churches were mostly loyalist congregations and a bit of fervent patriotism. Churches in the South tended to side more with the patriots, but again, they were still, because they were Church of England, they were still connected with, in nominal terms at least, with the British. And so, instead of a church collapsing in on itself, though, once again, here's William Smith from the College of Philadelphia, who begins organizing meetings in 1780, even before the official end of the war, to discuss the problems of what is the future of the Church of England in the colonies / future, whatever country this is going to be. What will that look like? Well, they adopted officially at that point the name Protestant Episcopal Church to differentiate themselves from the colonies. They drafted a charter that Smith's convention was held in the state of Maryland, and the state of Maryland, or its Congress at least, approved that charter. So a state church, state recognized church, and they identified several candidates for ordination to the priesthood, and they selected, William Smith as consecration for their bishop. Didn't really go anywhere, but that conference, that convention was noticed, because then there was a gentleman named William White. William White was the rector of a church in Philadelphia, or became the rector of a church in Philadelphia, and also became the chaplain to the Continental Congress during the Revolution. So he was a fairly influential figure and was well known, unlike some of his colleagues in Philadelphia who tended to have more loyalist tendencies. He firmly and decisively sided with the Patriots during the war, and as such, he had a lot of currency after the war, and he began to organize what were called general vestries, in which clergy during this time at the end of the war and into transition after the war could exercise some of the functions of the bishops, a la like commissaries, except they would have no secular authority whatsoever. And as a result, you had some of these presiding clergy, as they were called, and a second body of the rest of the clergy, and then a third body of lay people that met in a unicameral body. So they were not divided up into houses. They met all as one. Well, then New York follows suit in this. They convene a gathering that follows the example of these conventions. Several states join in this convention, and they decide that each state would have a bishop, that these bishops would be ex officio members of a unicameral general convention in which clergy and laity would vote by orders. What does that mean? Well, a lot of times in our general convention now, which I'll talk about now here in just a little bit, a lot of times what happens is you have clergy and laity who vote separately on the same issue, and it has to carry in both orders in order for a resolution to pass. And occasionally a diocesan convention will do this, and on some things is required to do that. And it was decided that the first meeting of this general convention would take place in Philadelphia in 1785. And so indeed they do meet, and then they meet again twice in 1786. And ultimately, 7 of the 13 colony/states at this point were represented. And at that point, they petitioned England for the consecration of 3 candidates for bishop, and those were approved. Now, a side note, some of you, again, who know this history know that there was actually a bishop already consecrated at this point, Samuel Seabury Samuel Seabury was out of Connecticut, but he was consecrated before Parliament passed a resolution allowing for English bishops to perform consecrations on American soil. Seabury had to be consecrated by non-juring bishops of the Church of Scotland. In other words, bishops who did not consent back when William and Mary came to the throne to their rule of England. But in 1786, Parliament did pass and allowed for this consecration. And so on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1786, William White and Samuel Provost, who was the rector of Trinity Church in New York, which is now, we call it now Trinity Wall Street, fairly significant parish in New York City, were consecrated as the first bishop. A year later, Thomas Claggett was consecrated as the first bishop on American soil, because actually White and Provost traveled to England to be consecrated, but Claggett was consecrated here on American soil. And so from that is where we say that gives you the origin now of the institutions that we have in front of us today. And so I want to take a break here and give a chance, just one for me to take a break, two for y'all just kind of give a chance to process. But next thing, so you know, I'm going to talk about our General Convention, more about vestries, and more about some of the structure, and then talk about ways in which it is similar and not similar to the governance of American civil politics in that way. But any questions about any of that? I know that was a whole lot of information in about 25 minutes there. Any questions about any of that? All right, so I'm going to ask y'all questions. I want y'all talking here. Let me ask you, what do you think? And I've given you a little bit of answer to this, but what today, this is answering for today, what does a vestry do? Who wants to answer that? Not to put current vestry members on the spot. This is for everybody to take a stab at. What does a vestry do?
They handle the finances.
They do have that role, and that actually, the origin of that does come from these things of, I don't know who this is coming in. I might not let them in. It comes from this whole, the idea back in the colonies that there was a management of the civil government and the taxation even of the local community. So yes, that is one of the roles of the vestry. What else?
They call the rector.
Call the rector, absolutely. Not an insignificant role. What else?
I thought they were the governing body of the congregation.
They are the governing body of a congregation, and I'm glad you brought that up, because we're going to get to that on the diocesan national level too, how that works.
They're the board of directors, the board of control.
Yeah, that's kind of a more 20th century term of describing them, but yes, that is correct. They serve in that regard. What are, based on what I shared with you about vestries, what are some things that either new responsibilities that vestries have today, or things that, from what I've said, you may like, I don't think they really are in charge of this anymore. Do you see any differences between what the vestries were doing then and what they do now?
It's something I wanted to hear about. I thought years ago, the senior warden had a more conspicuous role than it does now.
Yes. And again, that really depends on where you were.
And who the rector is.
Yeah, well, who the rector is. Yeah, it does have some personality base to it. It also depends, though, on and those of you who have either from New England or lived in New England for a while, tell me if I'm wrong. My experience, though, with a lot of my colleagues in New England is that they tend to be in churches where, again, that you can still have very vocal, very strong vestries, but they're my experience with working with those colleagues, particularly in Providence 1, is that they have more of a sense that the priest really is the one who makes all the final decisions on everything. And cut to being in Virginia for 3 years, where the priest. I heard a person say this one time. In a class that I was taking on vestry leadership. Ironically, it was a guy who was a vestry member at a fairly large church in Virginia outside of DC. And he said, well, here in our church, we appreciate the priest giving the sermon and doing some pastoral care and giving the lesson. But that's really all we need him to do. We got the rest, and we really don't like him crossing over that line to do anything else. Like,
that wasn't my experience in Province 1. The vestry
in Province 4.
At my first vestry meeting, we fired the rector.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
This was here in Province 4, up in Province 1. Province 4. Yeah.
1, Massachusetts.
Oh, Province 1. Yeah.
And my experience was that we certainly took the advice of the rector very seriously, but we were the ones who set the path.
Yeah.
We're going to give him more latitude in how he did it, because that was his role.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I think a lot of it today is more driven by the personalities. To be quite honest, I think that's a lot of it. The personality, the interplay of those between the priest and the vestry. But the vestry does still have the canonical role of not only what's called the quote unquote temporal affairs of the parish, but canonically the vestry is also charged with working with the rector on, use the term you use, Victoria, of setting the path forward. And a lot of times, and nowadays, it's preferable that both priest and vestry work together on that. A lot of times where those things go haywire in today's world is when one side sort of dominates over the other for whatever reason that may be. Either the priest doing their job, the vestry not doing their job, or you just have a lot of really strong personalities that want to exercise.
We're in a much hierarchical society.
I'm sorry?
We're in a much less hierarchical and patriarchal society.
Yes.
Or at least some of us try to live that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that kind of is a good transition now into diocesan and national structure, because in both the diocesan and the national structures, so the authority in each diocese is, of course, everybody knows about a bishop. The bishop, however, does not have unilateral power. There are several organizations actually within a diocese. There's 2 in particular. There's some smaller ones that exercise authority as well, that in essence share that power of decision making with the bishop. Let's see if y'all can guess. One of them probably is pretty easy. Let's see. What's one of the structures of a diocese? Meets every year.
Convention.
Yeah, convention, diocesan convention. So the convention is charged with passing legislation that, basically they approve the budget for the diocese for the year. So they carry the fiduciary responsibility. Any resolutions that are passed, any changes to the diocesan canons have to pass through convention. So, anything that is a major change within the operation of the church has to pass through. Whereas in other denominations, for sure, that, a canonical, certainly a doctrinal change comes straight down from the bishop or from the clergy authorities. excuse me, we have must be bath time next door. Your little plumbing issue here. Can you guess what the other structure might be? This one may be a little harder.
Is it bishop and council?
I'm sorry?
Bishop and council?
Close. Bishop and council serves more as, bishop and council serves in many ways like the finance committee of the diocese. I mean, they're an advisory committee, but they don't have canonical authority. But there is an organization like them that has canonical authority. Not the bishop and council, but the standing committee. Every diocese has an organization called a standing committee. And the role of a standing committee, first and foremost, is to provide, counsel and consent to the bishop. But the standing committee also has to approve anyone who gets ordained. So, which is a big thing. The bishop can't just say, I pick him, her, and this person over here, and I'm going to ordain them. The process of ordination, the bishop does have the final call on that, but every postulant, as we're called when we go through that part of the process, has to go through the standing committee, and the standing committee has to approve them. And you think about that, that's a fairly significant step, because it does have vestiges of this, I was talking about in Virginia, where the legislatures or the vestries would have a role in picking the rector. So in other words, it's not either the bishop or the vestry, but rather the bishop in consultation with this body that is not a vestry, so to speak, but is a council of clergy and lay members who do have to offer that consent. And the standing committee also, when a new bishop is elected in a diocese, and I'm not talking about in your own diocese, in any diocese of the Episcopal Church, the standing committee has to give consent to the election of that bishop, and that bishop can only be consecrated with the consent of the majority of the standing committee. So there you see a body, again, it's clergy and laity, but in many ways it represents laity from the perspective you have a bishop and you have other members of the church who have to approve this. The bishops obviously have to approve the election of a bishop in another diocese too, but so you have that structure. And then at the national church level, I'm going to read you something directly out of Bob Pritchard's book, because I think it's a lot easier for me to read it than for me just to summarize it. But so kind of quiz you here and just see. So Michael Curry is
Presiding bishop.
He's the presiding. So what does the presiding bishop do?
Presides.
He presides, that's right.
Well, if the bishop is the pastor to the clergy, the presiding bishop is the pastor to the bishops.
He is. And he does preside over the House of Bishops, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. But Michael Curry in particular, I mean, obviously we see him on TV a lot. He's doing things like royal weddings and all this other stuff. What other roles does he have? You've stated his canonical role, or his main canonical role, but what are some of the other things that the presiding bishop does?
I think he's the convening authority, if you will. So he has the power to convene the bishops and the church as a whole.
He does. He does have the power to convene the bishops unilaterally. He does not have the unilateral power to convene General Convention, and that's so they kind of get into that now. So General Convention, of course, you saw a little bit of that in the development, the history that I was giving you. The General Convention meets every 3 years, and the idea, as it was in the colonial days, was to gather all of the churches from all over the diocese and provinces of the Episcopal Church, gather them together for the express purpose of reminding everyone that we are one church gathered together, and we're not this group of congregational bodies that's out there. But the General Convention is the authority for the national church. And let me read this real quick because it kind of close in some gaps here. So in Pritchard's book, and just since I'm doing this on recorded here, for those of you who might be watching on YouTube, and for those of you watching here live, it's on page 174 of his book, History of the Episcopal Church. Just want to make sure that citation is said. But he talks in one of his chapters, as the United States rapidly grew in size around the end of the 19th century, really beginning around the period of 1880, the Episcopal Church was growing rapidly along with it, and the structure of the church had to change. And so he writes, Episcopalians recognized that such growth required adoption of more sophisticated systems of organization. The bishops and deputies at General Convention gradually reshaped the church into a more efficient modern institution. Let me throw in something in here. The term diocese, as it's known in the Episcopal Church, of course, dioceses have been around in other denominations, certainly the Catholic Church, for a long time. But in the Episcopal Church, dioceses were not really recognized as dioceses until around the 1830s. Up until that point, after the first General Convention in 1789, or the first official one in 1789 that adopted the first American Book of Common Prayer, it was basically recognized, instead of diocese, each state had its own churches. So it would be, say, the church in Massachusetts, or the church in New York, or the church in South Carolina. It's not the diocese of, but just the church. So, but dioceses by this point in 1880, 1890 have formed. And it says, realizing that the church was too large to be run out of the offices of the various clergy and bishops who were chosen for national office, they established the church's national headquarters at 281 4th Avenue in New York City, and that was done in 1894. So the national church at that point, whoever the presiding bishop was, and that, I'm going to read down, you'll hear more about that. Usually the national church offices were in the office of whoever the presiding bishop is, in whichever diocese that is. So in 1894, that changed. The Episcopal Church, as it is today, has a central headquarters in New York. They moved into a different building, obviously, since then, but they're still headquartered in New York. In 1913, the General Convention grouped the diocese into provinces and adopted a canon on business methods that standardized everything from accounting procedures to the way in which attendance was recorded across dioceses. In 1919, the General Convention created the National Council, an executive body that was renamed the Executive Council in 1964, which has the authority to act for the church between sessions of General Convention. In the same year, in 1919, that same year, Convention altered the method in which presiding bishops had been chosen. Since the time of Bishop White, the bishop who was senior in terms of date of consecration had presided over the House of Bishops. After 1919, the position became an elective with a 6-year term. And nowadays, it's a 9-year term. Bishop Curry was elected in 2015, which is hard to believe. So he really has about one more term coming up, or one more 3-year period of in between conventions. So from that, I want you to hear how the church became more centralized and yet retained this very democratic process in which the bishops had power and authority but were not in charge. The General Convention is the body that's in charge, and this entity that is now known as the Executive Council, which is elected out of General Convention, operates and manages budget, worship oversight, all the programs of the national church in between the sessions of General Convention. So the next General Convention will take place next summer, 2021. It'll be interesting to see how that how that will play out with COVID. But and then within the General Convention, you have, it's no longer a unicameral body, but it's two bodies. The House of Bishops, which is where Michael Curry is the presiding bishop, explicitly presides over, but also the House of Deputies. The House of Deputies, every diocese for convention elects 4 clergy deputies and 4 lay deputies who go to convention, and they don't necessarily act on behalf of the convention. They really act for themselves, but they do vote as a diocese. And the House of Deputies is presided over by a president who can either be a priest or deacon or a lay person. And the House of Deputies, despite the fact you don't really see the House of Deputies on the news as much, exercises just as much authority in the overall General Convention as does the presiding bishop. Really, the only difference is that the presiding bishop, for the most part, presides over the joint meetings when the two houses of convention meet together, because part of the convention they meet together, part of the convention they separate. But go back to what Victoria said earlier. It's the fact that it is a balance between the fact that, yes, we recognize that bishops carry a special kind of authority, but this is a church where the laity exercise great authority. So it is not run in the sense that the laity or the bishops, either one, get the final say. Both bodies have to work together at the national level in order for programs to be passed, in order for any sort of vision to be cast out of General Convention, and that is very intentional in the design. It's frustrating in the sense that sometimes the bishops in the House of Deputies don't always see eye to eye on certain things, particular social issues like the official recognition of, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Ordination of women.
Ordination of women. That one was, well, both sides were very slow coming around to that.
We're not done with it yet.
No. And the affirmation and acceptance of LGBT clergy, which was first done in 2003, but that was something that had been building for a while. The House of Bishops came around to it. It'd take a little longer for the House of Deputies to come around to it. So that creates a lot of frustration, but the trade-off of it is the fact that one side does not dominate, that both sides are regarded as having a very important and very equal voice in those affairs. So just like with national politics, the importance of being involved in these kind of things. And I preface this with saying I have no desire, especially at this point in my life, to be a deputy at General Convention. I have been asked, however, to serve on some of the subcommittees that work, particularly there's a program, budget, and finance, and then there's a liturgy, music, and arts one that I've actually had been asked to consider serving on one of those subcommittees. You don't go to convention, you're not a deputy, you're not an officer of any sort, but you do work on one of these subcommittees or standing committees, as they're called, or commissions, sorry, standing commissions that are charged with reporting back things such as the liturgy, music, and arts. Do we do a prayer book revision? Do we want to add saints to the calendar? Do we want to look at new supplemental hymnals or things like that? Those major big level decisions happen within that body. And again, it's on those standing commissions, both bishops and deputies, clergy, lay, are involved in that process. And so, unlike what seemingly our Congress is becoming, which seems to be a lot of people who seem to think very highly of themselves and their own positions, and come from particular backgrounds, although we seem to be having a little more, fortunately, diversity that's been coming in over the last few years. But the Episcopal Church General Convention is very geared to try to be, to include both sides and to try to work on including people from all over the church, in the fact that the church, deputies come from every diocese. They also come from, we have dioceses outside of the Episcopal, outside of the United States, I should say. Before the earthquake in 2010, the Diocese of Haiti, which of course we know well at St. Stephen's, was the largest Episcopal diocese. I don't know what the numbers of that are now. I don't think it is anymore, but before the earthquake devastated them, they had the most churches and they had the most parishioners. I know they had the most parishioners in a diocese, which floored me when I found that out. There's also an American Convocation of Episcopal Churches in Europe, which is, one sense, an expat church, but also is a church that does missionary work within Europe. In fact, there's 6 countries in Europe that have one of these churches. I think the lead church is the cathedral in Paris, a horrible place to serve. There's one in Rome, there's one in Florence, there's one in Munich. And I know obviously I'm leaving out a few, but all of those, that diocese, the convocation in Europe, send deputies to General Convention. And then the last really quick note here, and then I want to stop and have a little time if you have any questions or anything, is mention provinces. And you heard Victoria and I talking about provinces a little bit earlier. So provinces come from this desire to gather people in regional areas together. Provinces, their canonical authority really is they can recommend legislation to go to General Convention. They can pass things for themselves, but they really don't have much power beyond that. We are in what's Province 4, which is basically the entire southeastern part of the United States. There are 9 provinces, and each one has its own synod, which I should know this, I think meets every other year, if I'm not mistaken. That's one actually I have to go back and look up. You don't hear a lot about provincial gatherings unless you're involved with something with the province. But so there's all these different layers of governance within the church, all of which are designed by principle and by the origins that I shared with you in the first half of this class tonight, to find a way to incorporate all people, to find a balance between bishops and laity, which is always, through the history of the church, has been a very tenuous relationship for many, many reasons. And so as many flaws as you can find in this governance structure, its intent and overall its primary function remains very effective. And some reforms are happening right now to try to streamline how General Convention works, because it's become so cumbersome in its administrative oversight. But the whole idea behind it is one that it not only incorporates people, but encourages participation at so many different levels: your local parish level, your diocesan level, your provincial level, and the national level, for involvement in not just being involved with your church, but having a voice and a say in the direction of your church. And that's one of the things I'm very proud of about being an Episcopalian, is that if you want to stand up and have your voice heard, this is a church that it's very structured. Doesn't always work this way, but in theory and most of the time in practice, your voice is heard at one of these levels. Let me stop there. I've talked way, way, way too much, giving you a crash overview course here in the governance and structure of the church. What questions about this or anything I haven't talked about do you have for me? I know we're right at our hour time, but I'll stay on for a little bit if somebody wants to ask some questions.
I'm curious about the relationship between the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion, particularly now. Did Lambeth happen this summer? It didn't, did it?
No, it's going to happen next summer is when it's scheduled to happen. They were talking about doing it and they postponed it. Now it's in theory on for next year. So real quick, because that's a whole can of worms issue there, but it's a very good
Exactly.
topic to bring up. And I purposely did not include it because we
I
can go off on these
know.
rabbit holes. But the Anglican Communion is a relatively recent phenomenon. Of course, it is formed by the fact that the Church of England, just like it did here, planted churches all across the world wherever it established a colony. All of those churches have, the beauty of it is all of these churches, wherever they are, whether it's here in the States, whether it's in Australia, India, Nigeria, all of these places have taken on a very different, I mean, similar in some ways, but very unique forms of governance based on their context. And all of these churches are loosely affiliated together and under the nominal head of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who really is about as nominal a head as you can be. And then the other issue with that, and I don't know if you were alluding to this, Victoria, but one of the issues too is with some of the churches that have broken off of the Episcopal Church over the last few decades over things like women's ordination, LGBT rights in place within the church. A lot of the churches that will call themselves Anglican,
Yeah.
they are and are not recognized as members of the Anglican Communion. That's a very Anglican answer too. Officially, they are not recognized. But the Archbishop of Canterbury has made it clear that he does recognize them as legitimate congregations. There's not been an official edict that says, yes, they can have a place at the table. Now, I say that, I know that the bishop, the rough equivalent of I guess he's called the Archbishop, what's called the Anglican Church in North America, his name is Foley Beach. Sounds like a
Oh, is that
spot.
Foley Beach where I ended up there? Okay.
Yes. Foley Beach has been invited to the Lambeth Conference, which Lambeth is a gathering of all of the bishops from across the Anglican Communion. They gather at several places. Usually Windsor Castle is one of their favorite places to gather. And they are scheduled to meet next year, and his invitation to that has not been without some controversy.
Especially since the American Episcopal Church was stood in the corner at the last Lambeth Conference.
Yeah. And since several bishops, and I have not followed up on this in a while, and this has been probably since before I came to Oak Ridge, so this is about almost a year old. But at one point, I know that several American bishops were not invited because of the fact they were LGBT and had same-sex partners, and they were, as such, some of the more conservative bishops. Well, they did come out and say this. They tried to say as nicely as they could, but basically they said, if those American bishops come, we are not coming. So, like I said, this is a big rabbit hole, big old can of worms that we can
what
get
you're
into.
saying is it's still a rat's nest, and we haven't made any progress.
Yeah, that's why I say the idea that our structure, and that's why I focus on Episcopal structure. And not because Anglican Communion structure really is vastly different. In Episcopal structure, yes, we are.
It's important to know that too.
Yes,
yes. Because I'm not sure I consider myself part of the Anglican Communion anymore, even though officially we sort of are, except we've been stood in the corner. I'm sorry, I don't stand in the corner for anybody. Not for that nonsense. So I just think it's important to be aware of the fact that there are big issues that that affect the Episcopal Church as a whole and standing in the larger community. And then there's that whole Southern Cone and Southern Hemisphere stuff, and we don't need to go there.
The Presbyterians and the Methodists are all dividing because of the social issues.
So the
not totally unlike what we saw at the church in Jerusalem when they faced what to do about circumcision and kosher foods and so forth. So,
Interesting parallel.
yeah.
Interesting comparison. Thank you.
No.
My next door neighbor in Oak Ridge was a pastor of a Christian church. And he would say, you guys are all the ones in the news. He said, but we're all facing the same issues that you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So whether they, advertised it or not.
And the Methodists are going through it right now. In fact, they're facing a split. They've only been delayed because of COVID, but they're going to have a convention next year, and that will likely be split after their last convention was very divided.
Pretty unpleasant. Yeah, it's unfortunate. My son was married recently, and one of his attendants was a woman and one of the bride's attendants was a man. And nobody thought anything of any of it. So I think that this is going to resolve itself in the next 20 years because they just don't give a rat's fanny. They just don't. They're past it all.
Well, any other questions? As I said, the Anglican communion stuff, I do another class on that separately. That's a whole thing of itself. But anything that I presented tonight, any questions?
Oh, thank you. That was a comprehensive overview, condensed very nicely.
It was really, it was very good.
Yeah, thank you.
One of my professors in seminary was noted for being one of those who you would like trying to drink water out of a straw through a straw out of a fire hydrant. And I'm sitting here listening to myself. I'm like, I think that's what I did to y'all tonight. But,
yeah, the resources are there.
But the good thing is this is recorded. So if you did want to go back and you missed something, you can go back and listen to it after Elizabeth gets on.
Thank you very much.
If you have any questions, if you have any questions about anything that you want to answer, just email me and I'll be happy to get it to you. But let me emphasize, my main point is, giving you all this information, but our church is very much one that encourages participation within its own political structure, and our theology, as governance really reflects, is encouraging of us to participate in the wider political realm as well. It is not, I'm going to use your phrase again, Victoria, it's not about standing in a corner. It's about, it doesn't mean you have to be rah, standing and doing, out in front, but it doesn't mean you stand in the corner. It means you're out there participating, whether that's loudly or quietly, but you are participating. But all right, my friends, well, thank you.
Thank you,
good
Bailey.
to be with you, and I will see you all soon. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Thank
you.
you.
Good to
All right.
see you.
Bye.